In this episode, we're answering some of our listener questions. We'll be covering company title properties, selling out of a regional location, what is an A-grade property, frustrations with land tax, and how to make space in the market for both first home buyers and investors. Is there room for both? Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, and author of Auction Ready.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say on here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of a professional.
Don't forget that you can access the transcript for this episode on the website, as well as download our free full or forecaster report, Which Experts Can You Trust to Get It Right? theelephantintheroom.com.au. All right, Chris, our first question is from Eva. She has written, what are the risks, advantages and disadvantages of company title properties, and how do purchasers and valuers put a dollar figure on them? Do company title properties appreciate in capital gains at the same rate as similar strata apartments in the same area, or is the lower entry point in the market a red herring? I've seen a few company title properties crop up, not in the lower North Shore or eastern suburbs, she's talking Sydney here, around Sydney in her search, and they seem to be marketed at and selling for lower than strata apartments in the same area. Love the podcast. Thank you very much, Eva. Now, Chris, I will talk about some of the aspects of company titles and also the areas in which you find them. But the biggie really is the funding of them, right? That's one of the reasons they're difficult. Why is that?
Look, I don't think it is a big issue, to be honest. We actually, the two biggest lenders, right? Some lenders will definitely not be able to do it because of their funding arrangements won't allow them to have, things that are are not vanilla, right, basically. And so if, it's a small apartment or it's a company title or it's a big rural acreage or it's worth more than $3 million or, it's a high density apartment, etc. Some banks won't be able to take that type of property on their books because their funding line won't allow them to have certain assets that back that loan book. But if you're talking like some of the biggest lenders, let's say the two biggest ones, the red and the yellow one, they would do it. Even, the third biggest lender, another red one would do it as well. So, it's not such a big deal. I mean, sometimes people can't use those banks because of policy reasons and they need to go to other banks to get their money. And, but usually they've got the biggest, broadest policy, those two banks as well. So it's very unlikely that you wouldn't be able to get a loan at one of those big lenders. And those lenders would do company title. Now, there are some, I'm talking...
Would they do one for first home buyer?
Yep. It's really just their policy. It's a product, their type of property, that security is fine. They don't really then say, it's now the person borrowing the money. It's too risky for them to then go and buy this type of property. So they would do it. Look, you do need to check it. Like that's absolutely the case. The same as limited title, which is a sort of another sort of ownership thing. So whenever you get a company title, definitely speak to your broker. Definitely look at the bank that you've got your pre-approval through, whether they would accept it. Because yes, definitely some lenders won't. But, it's not to say you can't get funding, and it's not to say there are some tricky things. Veronica and I, coincidentally, I know we haven't spoken about this before the podcast, but a client we were working on together in the past, the owners of that property couldn't get something through council. They tried to get tricky. They did a company title. And they basically did a duplex on a company title and then try to sell it off as two different properties. And the bank said, no chance we're going nowhere near this, right? So that's like a company title, but it's not a genuine company title like in an apartment block, etc. So, I think it is a bit of a myth, that you can't get funding on them and that, maybe it is factored into prices because that myth is out there. But it generally shouldn't be. I think, company titles shouldn't be a problem as long as you've got a good broker and you know where to go to get your money.
So a bit of the history of why you might find a company title building, and that is because before strata title was invented as a method of ownership, they had to find out a way to actually carve up a building so that people could just purchase a bit of it and live and operate in their lot, right? And so company title was invented effectively before strata title. So you will get older buildings that may have been built before strata title was invented that have not been converted to company title. And there's this whole spectrum. There's at the lower end of it, they look and act like strata, and you can rent the apartments out because there's unrestricted company title right up to highly restricted, right? So at the highly restricted end, they will have a board of directors or a board, and they will actually interview and vet any potential purchaser coming into that building. So you've got highly restrictive. You'll never be able to rent the property out to the point that they'll even decide whether you can own one or not, right? Down the other end of the spectrum, as I said, that you can easily rent the properties out, et cetera, et cetera. And in the middle of that, there's a building I've actually bought for 2 clients in this building in Elizabeth Bay in recent years. And they've got a bylaw, or I guess you call it, that means that you can't actually rent a property out in the first year of ownership. And so in that particular case, they really do want it. They skew more to owner-occupier, so they can actually write rules that are more prescriptive and more restrictive than you can with strata. They're governed by different legislation. And so there's all sorts of little complications, which is why you need to have a really experienced conveyancer in that specific area so that they can advise you on how a particular building would differ. The other thing too is it's like the out of the ordinary. Chris was talking about a property which was a duplex. So it was quite a substantial home in the Lower North Shore, and it was in the whole setup of that company that was really weird in terms of all sorts the actual law, the rules within the company. And so that's ultimately why the bank knocked it on the head, because it was like, well, it's not typical. It doesn't function in much the same way as like a Torrens title house would. So that was just too weird.
Yep.
But most apartment buildings that are company title don't have all that weirdness, right?
Yeah.
And so, but then you might find that, and so in a place like Elizabeth Bay, Rushcutters Bay, Potts Point, that sort of part of Sydney, there's a lot of company title buildings, so it's the norm in the area. Whereas I remember as a sales agent, I sold a couple of little company title apartments, red brick numbers, really horrible little things, really in retrospect, in Leichhardt, right? Now they were odd, they were weird, that like all the other red brickers in the area were all strata title, and then there's this handful of odd ones that are company title, and that became a problem because they're the odd properties out. And you scarcity is a good thing in property, but not weirdness. There's two different. It's weird scarcity, and so you've got to be very careful that wherever you buy, if you're going to buy a company title apartment, and certainly in that sort of Rushcutters, Elizabeth Bay, that area where they're commonplace, as long as they're not restrictive, I would definitely continue to evaluate a property, even if it was company title for a client, whereas other areas I would probably rule it out. And because of that, in those areas that I mentioned where it's quite common to find company title, you will find that there's not necessarily a discount that you pay when you purchase them. They pretty much sell for the same price as strata because they're roughly 50% of the stock. Whereas in those areas where they're an anomaly, there is a discount there because you've got a smaller buyer pool. So you've got less people that can compete for them. And then when you go to sell, the same thing's going to happen to you. So it's effectively a B or a C grade property, which we'll get to a little bit later here. And those properties don't generate the amount of competition. So yes, sure, you get a discount when you buy, but you're also discounting your rate of growth. So that it's not you're discounting in, discount out, and it doesn't matter. It does matter because that's exponential. It really is the compounding nature of that discount that is what's going to disadvantage you down the track when you go to sell it.
Yeah, I think it's really a good point. I mean, you need to be checking the strata report when you're buying, etc. But if you're buying a company unit, you want to definitely be going through obviously all the minutes and really understand exactly what you can and can't do. Some of the restrictions are actually quite good. Like if you can't rent it out, or you can only rent it out for a certain period, etc. If you want an owner-occupier building, which is definitely going to drive prices up more than say just an investor building. That might not be such a negative thing, but I agree with you, Veronica. If it's an area where you've got lots of company title, a lot of people are dealing with those issues, right? They've evaluated a property and thought about it. But if it's in an area where there's very limited amount and then people get hit with this company title, which is where your question's potentially coming from, you're a bit hesitant. And, when you've got a bit of uncertainty, you're going to move on to the next property. And, and speed and emotion is kind of the opposite of that, right? You get highly impulsive, etc. And so better prices will be for the properties that are easier to buy, and removing any roadblocks is a good idea whenever you try to sell a property. And, company title doesn't always have to say company title as well. We can't remember any clients changing from company to strata, but I know that it's possible. And so, you might find that you can sort of rally the troops, but that's nothing guaranteed. So I wouldn't go and buy a company title and then think you can change it to Strata. I think it's wishful thinking, but they do change over time as well if it's an issue for a building. And so yeah, I would definitely, like Veronica said, if it's in a quality area where there's lots of company title, don't just say, I can't buy that because it's company title. It's like when some clients say to me, I don't want to buy that because it's going to auctions. I don't want to go to any auctions. I'm like, well, you're probably never going to buy a property because, especially in hot markets, it's just part of the way of doing business. And so, yeah, don't put limits on yourself, like ruling out properties for, say, company title if it's in a good area and it's a good asset.
Now, our second question is from Gary. He says, hi, Veronica and Chris. Huge fan of the show. Thank you, Gary. My wife and I luckily FOMO'd into our first home late last year. He actually, I think he sent this. Yeah, I think he meant the end of 2020. Yeah. We might have had this question for a while. It's located in one of the more affluent suburbs in the Shoalhaven region of New South Wales. The property is 3-bedroom, 1 bath, built in the 80s, has nearly doubled in value in slightly under a year. Oh my God, you've got to be happy with yourself there. 700K to 1.35. He did undertake 150K of renovations. The dilemma we face is that this property is far from A grade and probably more akin to a dog. Being in a bushfire zone, right? My question is, do we sell the house now? Okay, apologies, Gary. We should have probably read this out when you first sent it to us. Do we sell the house now while we're in this boom and upgrade to a superior property? The price differential between ours and A, B grade property in the area is not all that great at the moment. The alternative is that we would make this house an Airbnb and buy another house, hopefully A grade in the near future.
Gary,
so this
I'm sorry
is
we've only got to this
one.
now.
Yeah.
If you have got something that's a little bit timely like this, probably don't send it to questions at the Elephant in the Room. Reach out to Veronica and I personally and chat to us about this, because I feel like we're giving advice to Gary 6 months too late, because the reality is when you say Shoalhaven, is sort of that Nowra down to Mollymook sort of pocket, right?
That's Illawarra. I think Shoalhaven's a bit north of that. But it's
no.
south of Wollongong, is it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you go Nowra, like Berry, Nowra, Kangaroo Valley, all the way sort of down to Mollymook, etc. So I reckon it's probably something like a Huskinson or something like that, Gary, where you bought a place, right? Now, my problem with this is this isn't commutable, right? So last year in 2020 and 2021, is this location was, highly pumped up in prices. It doubled, as you're sort of talking about, which not really, but minus off your reno and all that sort of stuff. But that area was really driven by return or worked from anywhere forever, right? Not the return to the office. And that's what we're seeing in 2022. We're seeing very, very big differences in terms of our clients' mentality, and the return to work is very different. Some people are actually mandated to go back to the office for certain days, and they cannot work from home on those days, and it's really quite restrictive. So they lost all that flexibility they thought they had. Some are obviously able to work from home predominantly and just go in a couple of days a week. And my problem is that if one party in a high-income couple, because that's what drives prices up, right? So if you can get 2 workers earning high incomes, that's the type of property that you want to own, because that's the one who's got the biggest borrowing capacity, right? Longer term. So if you've got a high earning couple, if one of those has to go to the city more, at least weekly, I don't think Nowra, and Jervis Bay is possible, because you're talking a 3 or 4 hour stint. So that would probably be an overnight stay. And I just don't think that's even possible on a weekly basis. So I was always a little bit worried about second tier regions. I actually think that it was driven by lack of properties on the market, but a huge increase in demand. And I was always worried that, especially the things that are B, C's and D's, and the dogs, probably that's the D, they're the ones who are going to get hit the hardest when demand really slows down and potentially supply increases. Because like you're saying, you're thinking about selling, Gary. So are the other people in that area that bought those houses for 400,000, 500,000, 600,000. They did nothing for a long time, then they doubled. They're like, hang on a sec, let's get out of this and let's move further down south. And put 500 grand into our super, because that means a lot of money to them. And so you definitely would see a lot more supply hit the market in 2022. And you've had a massive decrease in demand because of return to work, higher interest rates, lower borrowing capacities. And it might even be a little bit too late, Gary. You might find that the A grades properties have really held their value because of lack of supply, lack of people selling, and also that there are people still who are going down to the regions, but there's a much smaller buyer pool, and that's usually probably the people who are probably would go for the top end first, and then they would price their way down. And so, and they're being much more picky this year. So, Gary, it's a really good question. If you sent it to us last year, I actually would have said absolutely. I think it's a good time to get out of B, C, and D, take your money and run, and get yourself into a grade A asset. But I probably would have said also potentially try to buy before you sell. And that mightn't have been great advice because you potentially, because the market moved so quickly over Christmas. You'd want to have maybe wrapped it all up in that sort of late last year rather than potentially trying to sell in the new year or something like that. And so, yeah, hopefully you did what you were thinking about doing, Gary, because I think you were on the right path.
One thing I will say that we do actually promote, send your questions into questions at the Elephant in the Room. But of course, that is something we check periodically when we're looking to put together a Q&A episode. If you've got something more urgent, you can actually contact us via the website. I do offer a limited amount of personal strategy sessions for people in this sort of dilemma. So just, not a huge amount, but just it's well worth reaching out if you have one of these questions. What Chris is sort of basically talking about, in a boom, everything goes up, right? And so the properties that rise the most in a boom are those sort of C grade properties. And when I say they rise the most, it might sound like they perform the best, but they're not. They basically become attractive purely because everyone's desperate, right? And then the minute no one's desperate anymore, then they just get dropped like hot potatoes. So, it may not be too late to sell. It might be too late to completely peak the peak the peak of the market. But the thing is, you never can do that in advance anyway, although you're obviously thinking about it. We only ever know that markets peaked, when it's past tense. So, and if it's only just peaked, it's not too late. You just got to make sure you don't price the property wrong. The really, really important thing when you're selling a property in a transitioning market as we have now, and it's interesting because just today I've been talking to buyers agents elsewhere in the country in some regional areas, and they've been saying, yes, the inquiry has been slowing down. Yes, buyers are, basically backing off, taking the foot off the pedal. And so there's definitely been a slowdown in price growth in Sydney, and we can see it once again in the rear vision mirror. It appears that prices peaked in January 2022. And it appears that is what's being experienced everywhere now. And so, there will be a downturn, and some areas and some types of properties will feel it much more keenly than others. And I do agree with Chris, anything outside that 2-hour commute from a major metropolitan area is going to, feel more so than others. So you've got almost a slight double whammy of the location being and it depends where in Shoalhaven you are too. If you're in the top end, you're probably on the edge of that 2-hour commute to Sydney. But if you're in the bottom end, you're looking at 4 or 5 hours, and the type of property itself. So it's not too late necessarily, but you got to get the price right. Because what happens often in a transitional market, when it just peaks and tips over the peak, owners are continuing in their sort of growth mindset, shall we call it, where they're continuing to have this expectation that the prices will continue to climb, and they're then out of step with the market. So when you're in step with the market, you can actually still price yourself more attractively than a lot of other properties that are on the market, because if it takes those owners more time to catch up with what's happening. So it's not necessarily a bad time to sell. You can still sort of get in, but certainly take the advice, get a really good agent and just take their advice in terms of how you set that price.
Yeah, and also be a little bit careful on just the short, easy thinking, which is, we'll just flip it to an Airbnb and keep it, and not making a decision on. There's opportunity cost that you'll have from that. You'll release equity. You pay. It might not pay any capital gains because it's your house, so that's a good thing. And you'll use that money to potentially go and buy something else, which means you have lower debt on that. By keeping it might limit what you can spend on the next property, and then you might buy another B, C, or D. So yeah, just think that through. What would be the impact of you keeping it versus whether you sell it on your borrowing capacity, and then on your next decision. But also maybe don't fall for the fallacy of Airbnb a little bit. It might not rent as well as you think it's going to rent. We always overvalue the things that we own. You probably overthink how much people are going to spend on Airbnb and how often people are going to spend it. And what they would do in winters, and, maybe where the borders are reopened, and whether people go back to Italy like Veronica's doing in a few weeks' time, and whether they stop going down the south coast because they've done that all in the last few years. And And so I think the Airbnb thing, once you take off costs, you take off cleaning, Airbnb itself, I think, is 15%. And then you pay tax on that. Are you really making much from an income point of view, especially when you don't need it from a personal point of view, because you're probably going to buy something else down there. And so you're not even getting a lifestyle benefit for yourself. And so, yeah, just be careful with that as well. I think sometimes, and this is not just for people thinking about Airbnb, it's some people saying, well, I don't want to sell it. It's a good asset, when it maybe not even be a great asset sometimes, but I don't want to sell it because you should never sell property. And I'm just going to go and buy the next property. And I want to keep that property because I've usually got an emotional attachment to it and a fear of selling and not getting what I think it's worth. And so think through always potentially selling assets, because you need to stay sort of pragmatic and constantly just make sure your strategies are in the right line.
I love the fact that you suspect that it's a dog.
Yeah.
And so you're obviously prepared to face up to that. So good on you, and make the hard call. You know what you need to do. Go and look into it.
I do one final thing, Gary. I think you did mention there why you think it's because of the bushfire zone. That could be because of the fear of bushfires, but also could be the building costs, right? Of having to build in those zones, and we're already worried about what's happened to building costs in 2022. Let alone if you had to do those building costs amplified because of different materials and all that sort of thing. So, yeah, hopefully it's all worked out for you, Gary. And if you've got any more questions, please just get in contact with us a bit directly. We'll be a bit quicker.
All right, third question from Kristen. Thank you so much for the podcast. It is so informative, interesting, and helpful. Thank you, Kristen. I have a few questions. One, I should say, how do you determine what an A-grade property is? B, or two, are A-grade properties only found in premium suburbs? How do you identify a premium suburb? And three, if I wanted to buy an A-grade investment property, a unit, for example, within 10 k's of the Sydney CBD, what property features would I look for and what would I avoid? Well, that's interesting. Let's A-grade for me is basically a property that will always get interest from buyers regardless of market conditions. That's fundamentally what an A-grade property is. And I first learnt this as a sales agent when I would go to an appraisal, and you just know, as a sales agent, when you're selling a property, you just know what's going to sell well and what isn't, right? So fundamentally flip that from a buyer's perspective. You want to buy something that is going to sell well, and that means competing for it. In most cases, it means competing for it because you want to make sure that when you go to sell it, other people will compete for it. And sometimes that means you can add value to a property that might not be competitive now because it needs some value add. But generally speaking, it's because what it has is a combination of characteristics that appeal to a broad cross-section of local buyers. So it's got the types of, the architectural style, it's got good natural light, it's got good balance, it's got good, floor plan, flow, garden, blah, 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 all the things that, there are universal things such as natural light, but there are also location-specific things that buyers will value in one location more than they'll value in another location, or more than they'll value in another property in the same location. So you've got to really get that local mindset so you understand how to pick an A-grade property in any particular location, which sort of leads on to the second part of the question, which is about location.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think if you change that grade A, B, C, D, you could think, I just think about compromises. Like, when someone looks at a property, how many compromises are they thinking in their head? Like, is it a real compromise to live on this street? Well, yeah, it's quite noisy and it's dangerous for kids and things like that. So that, that would make it less demand and less enticing. In down markets, people would say, no, I'm just going to be a bit more patient and wait for a better street. Or, what's south facing? And that's a bit of a compromise because we'd love a north facing rear so we get sun on the back of the property where we spend all our time on weekends rather than it being really cold in winter. So it's a compromise. So just think about it in terms of, it's got lots of stairs. Is it sort of got a weird floor plan, et cetera, that you can't potentially change, or it's expensive. And so just think about how many compromises. And if you go into a property and go, absolutely, it's an amazing location, it's got great aspect, it's really great accessibility to all the lifestyle suburb in that suburb, it's not a rat run in terms of the road, etc. You'll also find that there's not many properties that turn over in the best streets that are uncompromised, because the reality of people living in it go, why would I leave this property when I know it's one of the best properties in the suburb, because I've seen everything else come on the market. I've been living here for 10 years and nothing else makes me want to leave our property for. And so you'll find that people have been living in the properties for 10, 20, 30 years. And so whenever they finally come up, there's a street right where I am, and one property's come on the market in the last 2 years, and there's one street. It's a very good street, and it's got amazing views. It's very quiet cul-de-sac, and one property's come on, right? And lots of other streets, like the busy road, there's like constantly properties on the market. They're constantly turning over. The same properties have turned over multiple times. And so, because everyone just knows that's the best street, or one of the best, right, that you want to be on. So, I think that's how you really know a grade property. And then I think you're right. It has to be that real market fit, because if the market is, say, a young family market with young kids versus, a downsizer market, or a cashed up retiree, or a holiday home, or you could have a beautiful house, but if it doesn't really suit the market that drives values in that suburb, and then, it could be a grade property for the right, but for the wrong target market.
Yes.
And because they're just not living in, they're just not moving to that area, right? And so, it's definitely need that local market fit. What was the second part to the question, Veronica?
Well, also on the location, I'll say that, a lot of people sort of, I know when they hear me talking about A, B, and C grade properties, they think, it's got to be like the most expensive house in a really good suburb. Well, not necessarily. No. There's different segments in every market. And so it's really looking at each price segment and each market segment, if you like. It's what's the most desirable in those segments. So, and for an area to be A grade, it really does have to offer that, proximity to lifestyle, proximity to employment, a good socioeconomic score. So we in Homebuyer Academy, we talk about Kent's measure that he loves from the ABS called the CEFA scores. Basically, it's measuring, ABS actually comes out with these scores for every suburb, which basically measures socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage. And so every single suburb in the country has a score. And so it's the elements that go into the makeup of that score, so it's the economic drivers. So you need all those things, but an area with all those drivers will actually bring people in who've got the incomes to then be able to support all the things that get built and the amenities that are available in that area to support the people who've got the money. It's this sort of endless cycle, really. And so you are looking for attractive, accessible, lifestyle type locations. Any sort of location where people only go to if they can't afford better. And look, let's face it, there's all tiers of affordability, if you like, right throughout the country. But, like I can go to, I don't want to sort of name suburbs right at the minute, but basically if the poor cousin, if the poor cousin is an up and coming and might one day become desirable, that's fine. And we've talked about bridesmaid suburbs before. But if the poor cousin is poor cousin because fundamentally it's too far away, it's got really bad transport, it's polluted, it's got no sporting field, it's got none of the things that people want. People only go there when in a hot market because they're compromising on all the wrong things. Then it's the equivalent of buying on a main road in a brilliant suburb. It's really, so how to identify a premium suburb, it's really about looking, do people want to live there? And would they live there if they had other choices? And that's fundamentally what it comes down to. Do they choose to live here regardless? If there's hundreds of properties on the market, would they still want to live here, and would they still want to buy that?
I think it's like really around, I think you're right. I think it's exactly, it doesn't have to be in the most premium parts of our capital city or the grade A suburbs. You can get grade A property in regional locations, but you have to think about it. The premium locations would be whatever, let's say Albury, right? If people are doing well in Albury financially, let's say they're a young couple and they're doing better than average incomes, and they're being quite aspirational and they want to give their kids the best life and they want to live in the city and get all the lifestyle benefits. What part of Albury do they want to be, right? What type of property do they want to own in Albury? If they, for example, business owners, if you're doing well in Albury and you're making millions of dollars a year in business, what would you really want? Maybe you want something in the town centre, a really big heritage house, or maybe you want an acreage on the, 5-10 acres just outside of town. And so it's just knowing where the people who are doing well within that location, where do they really want to live, and where are they going and competing on property and paying overs to get into that suburb? Because you'll also find that people don't want to leave those pockets as well. So you have a shrinking supply, but you have a growing demand because there is scarcity, because there's only so many big heritage homes near the town centre in Albury. I'm just picking a random place. And so it's where people are doing well financially are moving to because of their lifestyle benefit and because it's an aspirational sort of move rather than driven by affordability. Because when people go there for affordability and then they do well financially, then they get out. and then they move back into a suburb that they want to be. So whether it was the
Or
western
if-
suburbs of Sydney.
If the
Yeah, go
market
on.
falls, if you go somewhere because of affordability and the market as a whole falls, they're going to go back to where they really prefer to be because that becomes more affordable. If you like what you're hearing here, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars, please. Every review helps make it easier for other people to find us and hear what our amazing guests have to say. We love hearing your questions and we're planning more listener Q&A episodes. Please send your questions in. You can send them via the website, which is theelephantintheroom.com.au, or directly via email to questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au.
Yeah. Well, yeah, potentially. As in, you're saying the aspirational suburb would also fall.
Yeah.
You're saying, yeah,
Under those circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge with that is that when people go to an affordable location, it's quite dangerous. And this because if you go there and then you want to upgrade into a better suburb, the stepping stone actually gets bigger on you. You know, the gap, the property that you could have purchased today, maybe it was a bit more of a stretch. So you might have had to spend, let's call it $1 million versus 800,000. Let's just call it to get into the better street or the better location. In that down market, the 800 does fall. You know, it goes to 700, but the $1 million might only drop to 950, and that gap gets bigger. Plus, you got stamp duty and selling costs, and so it's one of those challenges where we see clients who I really just want a new property, and we don't want to do a reno, and we're just going to go and buy this house and land package, and we're just going to buy it because we want to live there. And then that they've got a really strong trajectory, and potentially they're going to outgrow that. Maybe they want simplicity because of young kids, and then they're going to want to upgrade into a better suburb because they're going to pay that mortgage off really fast, and you can just see the writing on the wall. Then they're going to go and upgrade. There's a client I know at the moment doing this, somewhere near Melbourne, and I was trying to drum it into them. Like they've already signed up to this house and land package that you would have been much better just buying this. And they were trying to justify it to themselves, and so. Yeah, that's probably the answer to the question. It doesn't have to be the most expensive parts, but it does usually mean that you're in the more expensive parts of whatever pocket or location you're going to be, because those things are already priced in. You're coming late to that party, right? You're not all of a sudden figuring out, the first person that's doing well financially wanting to move to that pocket of a city. Like this is ingrained in the growth of that location, that's the better part to be because of the lifestyle benefits. And so you can't all of a sudden just get a grade A property and then get it at a grade B or C price. You're going to have to pay more for it straight away. The third part of your question, if you want to buy an A grade investment property in Sydney, and it had to be an apartment. I personally try to get into, 3 beds are usually probably out of reach, and there's not that many of them. So if you could, yeah, great, but you might not be able to have the budget to get into a good 3 bed. But I'd probably really try to encourage you to get into a bigger, 2 bed if you can for your budget. And in an area where houses are really expensive and where high-income young families are forced to sort of move to because they can't afford to buy a house in a location they really want to be. And so it's areas where they're not usually building many apartments. So it might be like Mossman or Fairlight or Balmain or the Eastern Beaches or Bellevue Hill or Rose Bay, Double Bay, and, other parts of the Northern Beaches, etc., where the great lifestyle, houses are really expensive, and people, families go, well, I don't want to move to, out west. I don't want to move really far north to Hornsby or the Shire or Central Coast or Wollongong. I just want a really nice apartment somewhere in a community sort of family location around the city that's got great schools, and I can easily get to the city. And when my friends and family come from overseas or interstate, we can access all the lifestyle benefits of the city. And so that's what I would really encourage you. Get an apartment that really suits the family market. Even if you're not potentially going to go down that path, I think you'll find you get much better growth than if in an apartment that's really tailored towards couples and singles and etc.
Yeah, I agree. You got to go for scarcity. So in what Chris is talking about, those sort of areas, there's quite a lot of apartments, a lot of those suburbs, but they're established. They're not, there's no more sites to build big apartment blocks in those specific suburbs anymore. So you've got to avoid, being on the edge of all of that. But you also got to look at within each complex or within each building, you got to look at what's the good apartment within each building, because, there's, in fact, I've written quite a few blogs on this over the years on my Good Deeds website, but there, because there really is, the building could be great. It could be really well built. Could it be really good real well run, lovely gardens, blah blah blah. But like only a small percentage of them actually have the best aspect, for instance, or the best floor plan. So there's you really do need to be very hypercritical as to make sure that you get the best one in the building. Because if ever there is a fire sale, which look, there shouldn't be one unless everyone's bought at exactly the same time and in the same financial position and under the same financial pressures at the same time, which is one of the reasons we advise you not to buy into a building that's brand new. But if there ever is a fire sale, which we don't see in these established areas anyway, but if there was, you want your property to stand out and you want yours to rise to the top of the preference list of buyers.
I was just thinking maybe even a fire sale. It could just be like...
I was being facetious.
Yeah, but it could just be someone just had to sell quickly and didn't know what they do. They used a poor agent and just didn't get what they should have got for it. The problem with that is that, let's say there's 6 apartment blocks and yours is the worst two, one of the worst two, right? And then one of the better ones, the first, second or third sells at 1.1 million and you think, well, hang on a second, mine should be worth 1.1 million. So they're one of the better ones, and then a valuer comes in and you want to sell, and then you've got to potentially sell it cheaper than that because everyone says, well, why would I pay that when that one sold? And you're like, well, that sold under... They didn't know what they were doing and they didn't know, and then that whole story gets lost, right? Because the buyers just see the number. And so, yeah, absolutely, you want to protect yourself. Also protect yourself from bank vals because the valuer will look at it and go, well, that's 1.1. This is inferior to that, so I've got to go under that. So absolutely. Also, you never know when someone else in the block is going to be selling, right? And you've got a campaign and 2 apartments are selling in the same building and you're like, bugger, and yours is the worst one. All your buyers are going to flock to the good one, right? So that could affect you. We had a client buy an apartment in the beaches on the weekend, for example. So premium suburb, absolutely one of the best ones in the block, north-facing aspect, a little garden, perfect for a family, super scarce, a little brick building on a quiet street, parking. And so that's all the things you really want and also the downsizer markets, I think, can be easily forgotten about. So you got, if it suits families, it's probably going to suit couples, right? It's going to suit singles and the same. But if you could also, the downsides are a bit of a different, and older kids are a different market as well. In a 2-bedroom apartment might be okay with 2 young kids till, I don't know exactly the age. I'll figure that out in probably 5-10 years time. But, at some point they, the kids probably want their own room and so but one child, it could probably last a long time. But a teenager child in a small apartment, 2 of them, it's probably a limited runway, right? But the downsizer market's a great market, especially if they are moving from a big expensive house in Mossman or Fairlight or Balmain or Rose Bay. They just want something lock up and leave so they can do more traveling and they don't need the big house and the maintenance. But they've got, peculiar needs, right, Veronica? What are some of the things that they really go for?
Well, they definitely like ease of access. They don't like lots of stairs, So, but what they do like, they actually do like to have kid friendly as well, because by that stage they might be thinking of having their grandkids come and stay for them. So that sort of young family segment, wanting that outdoor space, wanting to entertain, wanting still to be close to amenities and everything, is actually quite similar, really, and but also that desire to be kid friendly, but definitely. As people are downsizing, they are more interested in mobility and accessibility. And so that sort of gets added to the list of would likes. And so therefore, that's why I think really having that garden apartments with a sort of that outside space connected to the internal living areas is really, really hard to come by. And definitely very valuable. So anyway, so that's the sort of thing. You've got scarcity. I think that's the really important message to hammer home when it comes to apartments. Our 4th question is from Nicole, one of my erstwhile favourite topics, hate topics, land tax. The thresholds and rates, from what I understand, have not been altered. That's thresholds increased or rates decreased for a very long time. Bear in mind that land tax is a state-based tax, not a federal tax. When originally set, presumably it was set so that there was a gap between land value and reaching the first threshold. So there is a land tax threshold that you can own up to a certain amount of value of unimproved land before the land tax kicks in. Now it seems just about impossible for that to happen purely because the thresholds have not been adjusted for many years. Land tax is a killer for a lot of property owners. Is anyone interested in lobbying against land tax? Share investors don't have to pay this sort of tax, and property owners already pay stamp duty as well. Well, you won't get any argument from me on that. What are your thoughts on it, Chris?
All right. I mean, I guess you're not paying a land tax on your home, right? And this is something to really consider, right? When you are buying investment properties, it's a cost. And, you know, we are, especially in the last few years, we could sort of see the writing was on the wall with rates, and, you know, clients would come to us and let's buy an investment property. And I go, well, let me just get to know your situation first. What are you doing with your home? You know, you're really happy there. You know, do you need to do a renovation? You know, do you ultimately want to move to a different suburb, etc.? Because sometimes it's better just to focus on accruing more assets that are under your home, you know, like, and that's tax free, plus you don't have to worry about land tax, etc. So you can do things to avoid it, you know, obviously you can go to different states and things like that, and, you know, and buy quality assets that way, etc. So you're probably not going to get me on a lobby list anytime soon. I think that, and also to get these things changed, I think the investors don't ever really get much in the conversation when house prices and property prices are going through the roof, right? So you're paying a bit of land tax, but hopefully land's a good thing because land's what goes up in value. You're paying it because you're owning the right portion of your assets in mostly land. And so your capital gains are offsetting any potential land tax. And then it's tax deductible anyway for you. So, yeah, I wouldn't be too concerned around land tax. I'd be focused on making sure you're just using that wisely, right? I'm not paying a lot of land tax. I'm not paying a lot of interest. I'm not paying a lot of maintenance. I'm not having issues with tenants. I'm not, you know, but I am getting a lot of capital growth, but I'm paying a bit of land tax. So that's how I would be thinking about it.
I wrote an article on this some years ago because I was, you know, just increasingly incensed about it. And I'll put the link in the show notes. And when I was researching it, because I got a friend of mine who's a tax specialist, and she was basically ranting at me. Well, she was ranting at me while I was ranting at her. We were ranting at each other. She's basically saying that, you know, land tax is a fair tax. And I'm like, why is it fair? And you know, back in the UK, I don't know when it was, there was a thing called a window tax. Did you ever hear about that, Chris? So landowners do tend to get hit. Property owners, I should say, do tend to get hit. We're a bit of an easy target when it comes to taxing, right?
Exactly.
So, but at the same time, you could argue, well, we're privileged, so we should be taxed. And so there will be people, in fact, our next question is from someone who may well, you know, argue that. So there's a philosophical as well as a social sort of question around this. My issue with land tax as it currently stands, and that is not a broad-based land tax in New South Wales. There's talk about replacing stamp duty with a broad-based land tax. That's where everyone who owns land pays a smaller amount than is currently being paid. So land tax is currently paid in New South Wales anyway by a small percentage of property owners, because it's only paid if it's an investment property and it's over a certain threshold of value. And you're right, those thresholds have really not changed. So therefore it's pretty hard to be under it, put it that way. And so therefore almost means anyone with an investment property in New South Wales is paying land tax. Yeah. However, I could have a $2 million house sitting on land. I could also have a $2 million apartment, which has the same sort of capital growth potential as the $2 million house, depending on where I bought it, what it was.
Yeah.
You go back to that previous question. If I really bought an A-grade asset, there was an apartment. So I could be looking at the same sort of capital growth rates for the two different assets. One's on more land than the other, and therefore I get hit with a land tax bill if I have the house, but I don't get hit by the land tax bill if I have the apartment. And I'm still a property owner, and I'm still, achieving the same sort of rate. So whilst people say, economists love to say that land tax is a fair tax, they say it's a fair tax because it doesn't impact people's behaviour. I guess I'd argue that it does. But whereas stamp duty is a transactional tax, so therefore it affects people's behaviour. That's their argument, right? I don't necessarily subscribe to it. I think there's more to be said there. But I do see it as an unfair tax, and I agree that there are investors in other assets that don't get hit with such a tax. And I just think that because property is that static thing that's easy to pin it down if you own it, and it's a lumpy asset that you can't get rid of quickly if you get hit with a big bill. And when prices are rising, and I know myself when I've been hit personally with big land tax bills in previous years, and I've sort of softened the blow by sitting down and really looking at my capital growth over that period of time, thinking, okay, it's all right, I'm still ahead, But I mean, sometimes it's pretty horrible. But when prices are falling, you don't get comforted by that. You're paying land tax whether you get income on that property or not, right? It's not based on the income you get. It's based on the value of the property.
Value of the land, exactly, yeah.
Sorry, the value of the land, yeah. And also because you simply can be more strategic around it and buy property in different states, and you avoid paying land tax to a great degree by doing such a thing. So there's ways in which you can get around it, which is why I still don't think it's a fair tax. But anyway, that's my thoughts. I'll lobby, but I don't think anyone wants to hear.
No, I think if anything, the momentum's the other way, right? We've got increasing CGT. We've got potentially getting rid of negative gearing. I don't think the change like reducing land tax, which it potentially mean for investors, is potentially going to something they're going to want to encourage, right?
It's not going to win votes.
No, exactly. And so I think you just got to sort of take this one on the chin, just say it's one of the costs of playing the game, and hopefully your benefits are bigger than the costs. They do want to encourage more home ownership, right? It's anything they can do to sort of discourage investors. But I think it's an important point. If you're paying a lot of land tax, you're paying a lot of expenses, and you're not getting capital growth, then you need to be factoring it in. You need to know your cash flow. You need to know that you're getting a benefit for this. So hopefully it's enough to wake some people up that maybe they shouldn't own this, and then that probably goes back on the market. And and that's a negative, right? We do need investors, which is what we'll talk about in the next point, because we do need rental stock. But I do think the writing's on the wall that it's going to get harder for investors to make money. And I think that's why it's so important that you're buying quality assets, which is what we talk about all the time.
100%. So our fifth question is slightly controversial. It's from Jim. He says, I've been listening to the podcast as a prospective first home buyer and have really enjoyed the detailed information in many of the episodes, and we appreciate that. However, Jim wasn't so impressed with one of our interviews late last year where we talked about challenges faced by investors. I think he thought we were doing a bit woe is me. In fact, he said it was, I quote, a real disappointment that reeked of privilege. Some of the concerns he had are below. I'll quickly run through them. Tenants in Australia have such limited rights compared to most of the developed world. How can we be shocked that state Labor governments are attempting to pass legislation that would support working class people? Next point is, it's not as if people don't have other options to build wealth for retirement. Super is one of the best pension programs in the world. Investment properties aren't an essential purchase. Proposed legislation in Victoria to capture a portion of the value created by rezoning is a no-brainer. The state should not facilitate significant transfer to wealth to private landowners and not share these funds with the community. I'm absolutely 100% in agreement with you there, Jim. There was a discussion around the need for increasing housing supply to facilitate affordability, but then rezoning projects that create supply were criticised when it affects your clients. Rezoning on large mixed-use sites create jobs, services, open space, and can create quality amenities for nearby property owners. And his second last point, build to rent is a proven and efficient typology to provide secure tenure for renters at an affordable rate. We can all invest in these developments through REITs and take advantage of the tax benefits provided. And so he's finished his email to us. It's not really a question, but he said that some level of critical analysis of ingrained attitudes around property investing, consideration of equality amongst our communities, and a discussion with conflicting ideas would contribute greatly to the podcast. So I do hope he's still listening. Yeah. What do you think of that, Chris?
Oh, Jim, you're bang on, to be honest. And we hopefully, if you've been listening to lots of our episodes, you can see that we try to multiple. Everyone's affected by this, right? You got renters, and I like my answer to that previous question is, I don't think the rights of investors, should be thought about first. I think it's society as a whole, and I think you're right around the tenants. I think it's pretty. You're very lucky to get more than a 12-month lease. I think your ideas around sort of increasing supply and, the getting value capture with developments is definitely, and we've covered that in episodes. We've done episodes on build to rent. I've got Adam from Mirvac. He started his own company, build to rent now. Before anyone was really talking about it, and we absolutely love that sort of model. I think the superannuation should be investing in build to rent and creating, thousands and thousands of home that, could be rented to key workers, could be impact investing, our $3 trillion of super could be doing. I think you're right there. So absolutely. I think you've got to be really careful with the whole investor debate. You've got to really think about society and the problems as a whole. But I think that, I guess you were talking about was, representing the investors and thinking about the investors, his sort of community, I guess. And so, I can see what you're saying in that question. And hopefully, Jim, you see that we tackle this at many different angles. We've done lots on homelessness. We've done lots on lots of different elements, building issues, etc., and all the impacts it has in society. And we understand that these issues keep getting worse, not better.
I think growing inequality is an issue, and not
Massively.
just in Australian society, but it's certainly a big issue here. And I think too, financial inequality, and a lot of people have came out and said that COVID has actually exacerbated and widened that gap between those that have and those that have not. We do, and a secure home or secure roof over your head is a basic human right. And I do actually think that one of the issues that's really coming to the fore with the whole the discussion around the affordability crisis in this country is that government has to step up. And I think what's happened in years gone by, the government really has sort of passed that buck a little bit in many regards to the mum and dad or the private individual investors.
Yeah.
And, I think they've been thrown under the bus in much the same way that first home buyers have been thrown under the bus when it comes to being incentivized to buy crap property. That a lot of investors have really been heavily, and negative gearing favors them and encourages them to buy crap property, and first home owner grants that specify you need to buy brand new do the same thing for first home buyers. So in a way, investors are, just as caught out effectively by government's inability to really tackle the issue with, the availability of rental stock anyway, and actually provide a solution there. They've really relied on individual investors. So you can't sort of then turn around necessarily and go, oh, all investors are evil. But at the same time, there is a mindset around there that, like, I just want to get ahead and I don't care about anybody else. So that, we do have to balance that. I think what's been interesting as well is that if you look at the market turndown that happened at from 2017, that was brought about, we've talked about it many, many times in the podcast, around the tightening up of investor lending. And that at that point, I think it was investor lending, correct me if I'm wrong, was around about 55% of all mortgages at the time.
Yeah.
It was ridiculously high. I mean, it was too high. And there obviously was that was a situation where, there's just far too much investor participation in the marketplace, and prices were driven upwards by investors, and that's clear. This latest boom has been driven by owner-occupiers, not by investors. So I think it's not helpful to the whole argument to say, oh, it's investors' fault that prices have been rising. It's not helpful also to blame negative gearing because, there's been economists that have actually been in favour of trashing negative gearing, have done studies on it and come out and said, look, it makes a minimal difference to actual housing prices. I do actually agree. I think negative gearing is also, in a way, a trap for investors because quite often they'll buy crap property so that they can negatively gear it. So it's an issue there. I don't think, I'm for negative gearing, but I actually think the way in which it's operated in this country, I think it can be done a lot better. And I think there can be restrictions to extra hurdles put in place to minimise the amount of investment in property, in a way that disadvantages first home buyers or gives investors an unfair advantage. So I think there is a lot of things that can be done, but the problem is at the moment it's all vote grabbing and there's very little investment from government in the actual housing stock and also in quality of supply. I mean, the answer is supply, but of course we don't want to encourage first home buyers or investors for that matter to go rushing out to buy brand new stock. So it's a bit of a, I'm caught in a rock and a hard place when it comes to actually that problem because of course governments have been incentivising first home buyers all right, but every time they come up with a new initiative, then that basically increases the amount of people out there trying to buy, which increases demand, and it does nothing to actually improve the supply side of the equation.
Yeah, the problem with supply is you've got to go and build it, right? It takes years and years, and we've got a strong growing population, both through just natural demographics. That's why we've done lots of episodes on demographics. It's such a key thing to understand, We've got Simon coming on next week again from Demographics Institute. And, so you've got all these people sort of getting older, getting married, having kids, divorces happening, et cetera, at the other end of the scale. And so you've got this greater need for housing, right? And then you've got migration. We've got a very strong desire to keep importing talent around the world and keeping, and students, et cetera. So we've got a very fast growing population. We've got very strong demographics as well. And we need to provide a lot of housing for all those households in the future. And You look at all our builders right now, we're struggling to get materials, we're struggling to build this. And the problem is, I think the government, it's been a 20 or 30 year problem. They've been building the wrong type of properties, poorly built in key locations, and have not built the real stuff that we need for our demographics. And that's the real issue. We've got a supply problem of the stuff that people really want and in the locations that they really want. And that stuff's not going to change overnight. And then you've got overlays with NIMBYs, etc. So it's a massive, massive problem here. And investors are only part of that. But, the government's obviously responsible a lot for it, I think, like Veronica said, for not taking action. And, that's what, unfortunately, they're only, because they get stuck with this big problem, they're like, well, let's just win some votes the next election. Let's access your super, or, let's do a 10,000, 5% deposits and all that sort of stuff, because it just sort of puts a Band-Aid on it to sound like they're doing something. But, it's a massive issue, this, that we all know about.
One other thing that he did mention, he's talked about rezoning, and 100% I agree that, because the single biggest point at which a property owner or landowner makes the greatest gain is when zoning is changed, or greatest loss, I guess, if it changes the other, in a disadvantageous way. And I agree that should be shared with the community, because they shouldn't benefit just because the rules have changed effectively. They speculate, sure, they're going to get some payment for that. But anyway, let's not get into the nitty gritty of that. But talking about the NIMBYism, now this is a maybe we should have an entire episode on this, really, because, I don't think it's fair to say, go through a heritage suburb, for instance, which has got loads of character and appeal and high land values, and go, okay, well, from now on, you can mow down all those big houses on the big blocks of land and put 4 apartments on each one, or 4 townhouses on each one. They're still going to be expensive, even if you could do that, right? They're going to be expensive because land's expensive there. You know what I mean? Like, it's just sort of, it doesn't solve the problem. It sounds really convenient to go, those people in Mossman, they'd never let a high-rise apartment building be built. Well, this isn't the available land to build it. They're not the site. Their sites don't exist. So, but I do know that there's an element of NIMBYism in some areas. I get that. But at the same time, and there's always resistance to change, that's human nature. But I also think that in some areas, I think you just have to accept some places are going to be expensive, and some places already have basically nearly everything developed, and they're not going to change an awful lot. And I don't think it is right that you should, impose almost communist rule on certain areas to say, right, that's it, I'm going to buy it up because everyone should be equal. I'm a capitalist with a heart, I guess. And I think that we should have the ability to aspire to things in this country as well. So, I'm getting a bit of a messy argument here.
I think you're right. Like, I think we need these sort of sanctuaries, these pockets, these lifestyle parts that make the city. It's part of the culture, housing and beautiful pockets and greenery and all that sort of stuff. But, I think, and maybe down the line they are top of the list, but there's so many other easy wins, right, of where they could be building, along the busy roads and certain pockets. And so that unutilized space is what they should be doing, and rezoning and saying, right, let's really focus on building some more houses here and let's deliver. And I think there's so many opportunities they need to go to first before they get to the sort of more premium suburbs and say, we're running out of land left, we've got to rezone all these suburbs, and it's free for all from now on, just to provide some housing. And that's the issue. I think it's going to be kicked down the line many, many decades before you start to see the most premium suburbs, heritage overlays get removed and everyone can sort of knock down.
I just think that it doesn't help to look at those who do have, right, and say, well, I don't have because they do have. And I think that's really where I'm getting at with this. Let's just focus on what can be done to give people a safe, quality experience, a quality home experience. And I don't think we're doing enough. I really don't. But I don't think it doesn't help us just to put our attention on that small segment of the market. Anyway, on that note, hopefully, Jim, you feel that we've done your question or your comments at least some justice. And we certainly don't shy away from being challenged as well. And we appreciate that you sent that through to us.
Jim, that's why we did the episode on the Falinsky report. That's why we get all the economists in there to debate, things like taxes, Brendan Coates and Salt Lake. And we have these big conversations about big points is because we know it's such a complex issue and there's all these intricate parts that affect things. And hopefully you keep enjoying listening.
In fact, we've put a summary in the show notes of some of the discussions that we've had around affordability in the wider context, and I think there's something like about 15 episodes in there. So if you really are interested in this, and that's without digging too deep with all those economist interviews, if you do, where it's been the main topic of the interviews, the episode. So if you do really, want to dig deep on this topic, go and check those episodes out.
Awesome. Thanks so much for today, Veronica. If you've got more questions, send them through, but if they're a little bit more topical and timely, and you want to get our advice on them or just our thoughts, definitely get in touch. And if not, we'll answer them on the future episodes.
If you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or North Shore, my team and I can help you buy without regrets. Reach out via my website, gooddeeds.com.au.
If you're looking to buy your first home, thinking of upgrading into a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, my team love to carefully guide you on this journey. And most importantly, get the finance right. Reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to see you again.
And remember, don't be a Dumbo.